If you've been following this series, you already understand something most people still don't. The XRP Ledger can grow without increasing demand for XRP the coin. And if you've been wondering why XRP price isn't moving the way people expect even as adoption grows, this is the part that explains why. Because in the last episode, we broke down exactly what's happening underneath. None of the three conditions that would force demand for XRP, the coin, actually exist in a consistent, system-wide way today. The path doesn't require it, the system doesn't consistently prefer it, and liquidity isn't concentrated around it, so demand stays optional. And that's exactly why so many people are confused right now, because everything looks like it should be driving price, but it isn't. Most people look at this through buying and selling pressure. They assume that if more people are buying, or if adoption is increasing, price should follow. But this goes deeper than that, because what we did in the last episode was explain the problem, and what we're doing now is defining the solution. So instead of asking why demand isn't happening, let's flip the perspective. If you were designing a system to force demand for XRP the coin, what would have to be true? Because demand doesn't come from activity alone. It comes from how the system is structured to move value. And when you look at systems that consistently create demand, they all share the same characteristic. They don't eliminate alternatives entirely, but they make one path consistently dominant over the others. Systems don't create demand by growing, they create demand by removing choice. So let's break that down. If you were designing a system to force demand for XRP the coin, the first thing you would do is narrow the transaction paths. You wouldn't allow value to move in multiple interchangeable ways with equal efficiency. You would design the system so that no matter how value moves, XRP the coin becomes a consistent part of that movement, not just optionally included and not just sometimes used, but structurally embedded. In the real world, that would look like payment flows that depend on XRP to settle, a structure where XRP becomes the dominant bridge between assets, and where alternative routes still exist but don't compete at the same level. Because once most transactions depend on the asset, most transactions contribute to demand, and that's how demand starts to become unavoidable. But when you look at the XRP ledger today, that's not how it works. The system is flexible. Multiple assets and multiple paths can be used, so XRP the coin can be used, but it can also be bypassed. And as long as that's true, demand isn't forced. This is why you can watch adoption grow, see new partnerships, see more activity across the XRP ledger, and still not see XRP price move the way you expected. Now take it one step further. If you were designing a system to force demand, you wouldn't just rely on structure, you would design for preference. Meaning even if multiple paths exist, one path consistently makes the most sense. It's cheaper, faster, and more efficient, so instead of XRP the coin being one option among many, it becomes the default route the system naturally takes. In the real world, that would look like liquidity corridors where XRP is consistently the lowest cost path, routing systems that default to XRP because it outperforms alternatives, and integrations where XRP becomes the primary settlement layer, not because someone manually chooses it, but because the system naturally routes that way. Because preference isn't about possibility, it's about probability. If the system consistently chooses XRP, demand starts to build. But today, that consistency doesn't fully exist. Liquidity is fragmented, pricing varies, and routing decisions change. So instead of defaulting, the system evaluates, and when a system evaluates, it doesn't force demand. Now take the final step. If you were designing a system to force demand, you would concentrate liquidity around the asset, because at the end of the day, value follows liquidity. Where the deepest pools exist, where the tightest spreads exist, and where execution is most efficient, that's where transactions flow. In the real world, that would look like institutions building deep liquidity pools around XRP the coin, major transaction flows consistently moving through XRP pairs, and markets where XRP becomes the most efficient execution layer across the board. Because when liquidity concentrates, everything else follows. Routing improves, efficiency improves, and preference increases. And when all of that aligns, demand stops being optional and becomes embedded in how the system operates. And this is where everything comes together. What creates structural demand isn't activity alone, it's alignment. The path consistently includes the asset, the system consistently prefers the asset, and liquidity consistently supports the asset. When those three things come together, demand becomes unavoidable. And this is the part that changes how you see everything, because when you compare what would need to exist to what actually exists today, you start to see the gap clearly. The XRP ledger allows flexibility, it allows multiple paths, and it allows value to move without forcing XRP the coin into every transaction, which means the system is working exactly as it was designed to, but that design doesn't force demand. It's also important to understand that XRP is always present at a base level on the XRP ledger through things like transaction fees and account reserves, but it isn't always the asset carrying the value in a transaction, and that distinction is what changes everything. And this is where investor expectations start to separate from how the system actually works. Because even when adoption increases, even when usage grows, and even when more value moves through the XRP ledger, that doesn't automatically translate into demand for XRP the coin or movement in XRP price. because demand isn't tied to activity. Structural demand comes from how the system is designed to move value, and until that structure changes, the outcome doesn't change. So now when you look at XRP, you're not just asking whether the system is growing, you're asking something much more important. Is the system evolving in a way that makes XRP the coin dominant in how value moves, or is it simply expanding while keeping demand optional? Because that's the difference between optional demand and unavoidable demand, and once you start looking at it that way, everything shifts. So in the next episode, we're going to take this one step further. We're going to break down what would actually drive these changes in the real world, what kind of adoption would matter, what kind of players would have to be involved, and what signals would show that the system is actually moving in that direction. Because once you see that, you won't just understand the theory, you'll be able to recognize it as it happens.